To start with, I wanted to explore a little more about an area that's been mentioned in particularly Frank's presentation, but in some of the others too, and I think is quite important, particularly given the prices that we've seen over the last six months. Obviously, we now have a domestic carbon pricing scheme, and Frank, you mentioned, the carbon border adjustment mechanism that's been talked about, and particularly more in Europe, I guess. But I think it's been interesting to see it in the UK in terms of, the very sharp rises, UK ETS wise, but also perhaps Treasury's coolness towards border taxes or further fiscal measures on that side. Perhaps, Frank, do you want to start us off in terms of how you see the future of carbon pricing helping in this? And then maybe we move to Harley for your thoughts.
Yeah, of course, happy to offer some thoughts there. So I think fundamentally, from us, the problem is that we, as it is at the moment, when we face carbon pricing, we can't pass that on to our customers like they can in the electricity sector. If you produce electricity, you kind of like if you do it via gas, it will be higher cost because of the carbon price, and you sell it on to your customers, and the customers can't say, I'd like to buy that from China instead. Our customers can and do instead simply say we'd rather kind of just buy cheaply somewhere else, and that's why you have the free allocations within the UK emission trading scheme, and before that the EU emission trading scheme. So I think that's fundamentally, because to us carbon pricing doesn't actually work as a tool because there isn't a global carbon price, and when there is like uneven carbon pricing globally in the world, you need to go in and introduce some kind of mechanism that makes that even or equal for us, so that we actually have a chance. Because otherwise, if you, for example, say you have to produce a ton of steel, at the moment with high carbon prices working last week before they fell, that would have cost us £170 per ton of steel to produce it here in the UK if we didn't have the free allocations. And if you can, at the moment, you kind of probably, if you sell steel in the market, you sell that within the margins of £5 or less. So if you suddenly have to pay £170 more, that you basically won't be able to sell that steel. And in that way, a carbon border adjustment mechanism is really helpful, because it goes in and say, if steel is imported into the UK, or any kind of industrial product is imported into the UK, it has to face the same carbon price as domestic producers. And that's like, if that kind of happens, you have a level playing field, you have a market you can sell it to, you know that you can pass the cost of producing onto your customers, and then you can actually see a carbon price work for kind of as intended to, where it would incentivize production of low emission industrial products, because the high emission industrial products become more and more expensive. But I think it's a fair assessment to say that the government has perhaps not quite seen the light yet when it comes to a CBAM policy. Although we are starting to see movements, and I'm sure my base colleague here will be able to maybe say a bit more on that. But 2 years ago, when we were talking about this, there was no talk about it. A year ago, we weren't told who the officials were who were looking at this. And then just here a couple of months ago, we saw CBAMs explicitly mentioned in the net zero review published by Treasury. So clearly there is a movement. What we are worried about is that it's perhaps not as fast as we would like to see, especially as the EU is implementing theirs in 2023 to 26. And there could potentially be some trade implications if you have an EU CBAM and you don't have one in the UK, because where's all the high emission steel that's currently going into the EU market, where's that going to go if you can't enter that market anymore? It might just be dumped in the British market, and obviously that has implications for our members. About that.
Thanks. Harley, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'm not that close to conversations on CBAM in government. I mean, I can certainly sort of take that away. I mean, I think you're right. You know, I think in the net zero cost of net zero review that was published by the Treasury, they were kind of fairly sort of lukewarm on CBAM. I'm not sure if that was sort of you know, the feeling from everyone across government necessarily in BEIS, especially. But I think there is work ongoing on that, and I believe that that is sort of coming back onto the agenda at the moment. I mean, you know, on the ETS, obviously we have the free allocations policy at the moment. I think we expect to consult in the coming months on changes to free allocation policy as part of the wider review to develop the UK ETS scheme as that scheme changes and evolves. And I think plans are for changes to the cap to be implemented in 2024 at the latest. So I think we'll be communicating the specifics on those changes in advance of any implementation.
Okay, lovely, thanks. Perhaps staying with you, Harley, I mean, I think you mentioned rebalancing and the upcoming affordability and fairness review. It's felt over the last 6 months or much longer, I guess, that conversation about rebalancing has felt very much about domestic households, their ability to switch, for example, to heat pumps and where that might go, with a little less perhaps from government on the implications for industrial rebalancing. Do you think you could say a little bit about the role that you see for rebalancing there, like when you might see it kind of coming through in earnest, particularly as we try to electrify some of these dispersed sites?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that the rebalancing conversations are not just about households; they're about industry as well. It's about industrial electrification too. You know, I think the fairness and affordability call for evidence will set out options for the energy levies and obligations that help to rebalance electricity and gas prices. And I think we're planning to take a decision on that this year. But like I say, I mean, I think the rebalancing conversation is both about households and industrial electrification prices.
But will industrials move later, for example? You know, if the options aren't there quite as soon as perhaps, say, domestic heat pumps are?
Not sure about that.
Oh, okay. I wonder whether Frank or Tom, you have any views on this one?
Tom, do you want to come in first? I just spoke, otherwise I come in after you.
I don't think I've got anything particular to add to this. It's not sort of a bit of the industry that we touch into too much. I mean, just the one thing that does strike me just listening to this is sort of how complex and complicated and how many moving parts there are in that. Yeah, we talk, and government talk, and we as businesses talk about net zero very freely, and yeah, we pay lip service to the fact that it's a huge challenge, and it obviously is a huge challenge in its size alone. But then when you start to drill down into the details of every different sector of what we need to do and the complication, I see Frank smiling wryly at this, but yeah, the complications that are inherent there. Yeah, I'm glad it's Harley doing it, not me as well. So.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Like, and that's kind of often the problem is that even when you drive into industrial decarbonisation, a lot of the sectors need their own bespoke sector deal effectively to enable decarbonisation. But going back to kind of the question from you, in terms of the kind of rebalancing call for evidence that's coming later, I think from our point of view is that electricity is not more expensive to produce here in this country than it is in Germany and France. It is the regulations and the legislation that set up that makes it more expensive for industry, because at the moment a lot of the levies and kind of that we face as industrial producers, they are we receive some compensation, some exemption for them, but these are simply just much higher in Germany, much higher and more generous in France. And when you look at network charges, again, I think the last time we did an assessment here in December, I think we paid an average of £9 per megawatt hour, while our German producers paid £1 per megawatt hour in network charges. Obviously, in the current prices of where wholesale prices are up to 500 per megawatt hour and the like, that is little in comparison. But when you have in normal kind of circumstances where your total prices are £50 per megawatt hour, £9 versus 1 is quite a bigger difference. And I think it fundamentally comes down to political choices about saying, where do we put these charges? And some industries are so trade exposed that perhaps we need to exempt them or compensate them sufficiently for these so that they can compete. Otherwise, we will kind of lose them, and they will simply kind of move abroad, or kind of production will kind of scale down in this country, and it will just happen elsewhere, and it will be wholly dependent on importing material, like vital materials, from other countries where we have no control over the emissions or how they're produced.
I mean, it's interesting. So, I mean, staying on the question of cost, I guess, and bringing you in, Tom, in terms of the conversations you're having are really interesting about, you know, kind of dispersed local electrolytic hydrogen from wind farms. In terms of the cost that you see that eventually getting to for the sector as a whole, do you see that being competitive? And what would be the role of, say, subsidy support, you know, the evolution of, for example, the contracts for difference scheme in supporting those types of business models, do you think?
So the short answer is yes, I think we do see that being competitive. We're very optimistic about this, and that optimism comes from a place of having been directly involved in the same journey with offshore wind over the last decade. So I remember sitting in rooms at Renewable UK with people saying, how are we going to get below £100 a megawatt hour? And half the people in the room saying, no, that's never going to happen, that's impossible. And look where we are now, yeah, the auction round, and that is through a stable, well-designed bit of government policy that delivers competition and scale. And if you do something similar for hydrogen, I personally see no reason why it can't be there. Hydrogen's got these advantages where it's one of a number of things that could be used to balance things out with intermittent renewable generation. So yeah, we are building, we have built lots of offshore wind. We are building more. Just talking about Scottish Power, never mind as a country. We've been awarded 3 sites in the ScotWind leasing rounds that's going to power 8.5 million homes. They're all built out, and there aren't that many homes in Scotland. Yeah, it's got to go somewhere. So some of that will come down the wires to other areas of demand. But there's always going to be a time when the wind is blowing in the middle of the night, everyone's asleep and no one's using it. And even in a world where we've all got smart dishwashers that come on when the price signals tell it to, there's still going to be excess power on the system. And so if you think about something like hydrogen, where you can use that power when it's cheap to drive the electrolyzers, it's got that wider system benefit that can that's on its side in a way that, you know, really lends itself to driving down the costs. And as I say, yeah, becoming competitive, I really think it can be.
That's really interesting. And just to follow up on that very briefly, I mean, one of the things that gets raised, I think, is, you know, that balancing act in terms of export to the grid and providing immediate kind of generation for demand there, with the use of electrolyzers for storage as hydrogen. It's often raised that actually electrolyzers are, you know, they'd like a little bit more to be a bit more baseload. How do you see it in terms of how, I guess, volatile that kind of mix of storage to direct grid export is going to be?
I think we're learning about it all the time, right? And yeah, hydrogen electrolyzers aren't the single answer. So I mentioned Whiteley Wind Farm, our big offshore wind farm outside Glasgow. So we're planning an electrolyzer there, but we have already built a big old battery on the site there as well. So that's fairly short release stuff. So that's their longer form storage. I think is going to be one of the big unknowns for where we are at the moment. Yeah, we're going to be putting so much renewables on the system. And batteries can only go so far. Yeah, they're great and they're useful and they're going to smooth out short-term peaks. But some of that longer form storage is the stuff that I'm now sort of starting to look at and see what's there. So I think hydrogen electrolyzers can be part of that wider ecosystem, but yeah, it's not going to be the whole thing.
Exactly. And perhaps if we stay on the topic of, kind of broader electricity infrastructure to support the transition, Harley, perhaps I think one of the things that I think is really interesting is just sometimes the mix that you see, right, in the level of network capacity that we currently have and some of the needs that in terms of reinforcement that we'll need for industrial electrification where we get there. And I mean, some of this will be very extensive, right? Perhaps you mentioned very briefly the electricity network strategy, but perhaps could you expand a little bit, I guess, about some of the challenges there, but also perhaps the lead-in times for having a kind of clear UK and regional strategy for the types of reinforcement we might need?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm not an expert at all on this. I mean, we know that government often are planning to publish the electricity network strategy in the next few months or so. And that is really going to set out a sense of the challenge and the actions that government and Ofgem need to take to ensure that the electricity network can act as an enabler to help allow our net zero target to be met. But I'm not really in the detail of that. I'm not very close to that, so can't say a huge amount.
Ah, no worries. No, it's a really interesting piece of work, I think.
Yeah.
Perhaps if we move to, I mean, what's really interesting, I think, about yourselves as panelists is the broader perspective you have. So not just in the UK, but more generally. I mean, perhaps Tom, if I start with you, I mean, Iberdrola, as you said, is global. Do you think, where does the UK currently stand in terms of the discussions and the policy development that we're doing on industrial decarbonisation, and are there other countries that we could learn from?
In terms of the other countries we can learn from, I don't know the answer to that one, I've got to say. But my sense is from talking to colleagues within Iberdrola, just before this, I missed the first half of the conference. I was on a call with guys from Spain and the States and Brazil. But my sense is lots of other countries are looking to the UK on this stuff. For example, talking about the stuff that we do, we Scottish Power, we're a long way ahead of the game on offshore wind, and we are driving things forward on hydrogen within the group. There's stuff going on in Spain. Spain are pretty well advanced on the hydrogen side as well, but I think the UK has got that reputation as a centre of good practice for energy regulation and energy policy, right? And that's based on, that's why Iberdrola keep investing money in the UK, because they've got that good, sensible, stable policy regime. And that's, that is what attracts those big inward investments from companies like Iberdrola and others. So I think, if that can be applied, that sort of, that overall feeling of stability and forward look in the policy around industrial decarbonisation, then I think we can continue to lead forward on it.
I'm with you. Frank, you mentioned you had a list. I love the idea of a voluntary tax. I'm not sure that's a tax at all, right? But what's your sense in terms of especially industry elsewhere that you're in contact with and where they're at on this?
Yes, I think I would very much agree with Tom in terms of saying that the UK has been seen as a leader in terms of decarbonising its electricity supply, and as one of the countries that have done very well on that. I don't quite share the same optimism when it comes to industrial decarbonisation, because I think at this point really we're falling behind a lot of other countries when it comes to the key regulations that are in place. When looking at the big announcement on decarbonising of steel and other manufacturing products, they're not announced in the UK. We've seen the Swedish plant, hybrid in North Sweden, which is looking to implement hydrogen-based steel production. I think it was 2 weeks ago, the French government announced they was investing 1.9 billion into ArcelorMittal to decarbonize their steel production. We've seen similar kind of announcement in Germany, in Canada, and the like. And the UK government hasn't really put in place the key kind of policy changes that we need. We're too high in electricity prices. We don't have any plans on CBAM policies, and fundamentally, kind of electricity prices are. I think I mentioned this already, that they're too high to encourage investment inwards, and then there's the kind of the lack of capex support, which is key as well. We have some relatively small funds, like you're looking at the IETF, the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, is 300 million, runs over 5 years and covers all of manufacturing, including data centers as well. And now the Clean Steel Fund that was announced by the previous Conservative government has disappeared. So trying to balance up that with a French kind of announcement of 1.9 billion, it doesn't quite add up. And that was just I think in 1 or 2 sites. So I think perhaps there really is an opportunity for the government to lead on this, because it's not like everyone is half a marathon ahead of us. They've run the first 2 miles and we're getting started now. But if the government puts the right policies in place, ensures we have all the policies outlined in my presentation before, I think really very relatively quickly we could be at the forefront of this development globally. I think that's where I think there's a great amount of opportunity to really decarbonize and move forward and show what it's like to have a net zero economy, not just a net zero energy system, but a fully net zero economy where all aspects of the economy is decarbonized.
Harley, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I think I sort of agree with both Tom and Frank to a certain extent. I mean, I think the UK is seen as a leader in this space. I think in terms of the introduction of sort of renewables into our electricity system, I think sort of the offshore wind sector has been a real kind of success story for the UK. I think significant investment kind of going into the CCUS infrastructure through the cluster sequencing program and the CCUS infrastructure fund. We're introducing business models for hydrogen and industrial carbon capture, establishing a transport and storage sort of regulatory model, and there's significant sort of innovation and deployment funding out there. I mean, I take the point that it's a confusing landscape of funding. I mean, a lot of people say it's very difficult to sort of know what the eligibility criteria and all of that sort of stuff, like the longevity of the funds, them being around, that sort of thing. But I think the UK's in it is a definitely looked at as an innovator in this field. I think the sort of the steel sector issue is probably a separate issue, which has sort of very kind of particular sort of political issues sort of surrounding it. And I probably agree with Frank's assessment. I think there's probably more that could be done on steel, particularly as a sector. But I think overall, the UK is in a strong position. And I think through sort of the investment that we're putting into CCUS and hydrogen particularly, it stands a real chance of reaping the benefits of being a first mover in what's going to be a sort of a growing international market. I think we sort of missed the boat a little bit on offshore wind. A lot of the manufacturing of wind turbines was done outside of the UK. I think there's an opportunity for us to make sure that sort of a greater proportion of UK content of CCUS infrastructure, network infrastructure, the actual supply chains is done by UK companies with the sort of concomitant benefits to UK PLC and regional economies as well. So that's what I'd say.
Yeah, exactly. I think the history of the wind industry is quite interesting, actually, because you might argue that actually it was the UK losing its nerve actually after investing quite strongly early on, rather than actually missing the boat, which might be quite an interesting lesson going forward. I guess maybe a final question, just as we wrap up. I think we have done very well not to talk about the gas price crisis today so far, but I'm going to do it because I think you can't have a conference on this day of all days and not mention it at least once. So I think for the conversations today, I think the thing that feels most relevant, I guess, is whether the current exceptionally high prices that we're seeing, and any broader disruption that we might see in terms of the energy system from what's going on in Europe, how far it might impact our longer term plans. You have some, for example, it's been great to see Kwasi Kwarteng, as Secretary of State, being really bullish actually on the impetus that gives us to further progress net zero. But also it's a really challenging time, obviously, where people are facing much higher costs that could impact their ability to invest at a later date. So perhaps it's interesting, I think, the kind of different perspectives we have on this panel. It'd be very interesting to hear how people are kind of reacting to that. Perhaps, Tom, if I start with you, and then Frank, and I'll end with Harley, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Before I come on to that, I'll just circle back very quickly to just what we were saying about the UK content stuff Harley was saying there on the wind. So the wind industry. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the success story that is there on UK content of companies like Scottish Power hitting those 50+% UK content targets. I think when you sort of think about we need UK content for a wind farm, you think about big factories building turbines, right, or building cables, and we've got that. But there is, it is a global market with competition everywhere. But the amount of other stuff, it is, mind-blowing how much goes into making a wind farm, and the amount of smarter stuff that is there in the UK content supply chain, rather than hammering up big bits of metal. There's some really interesting, smart, innovative things in the supply chain, and I think that may well be. We like to talk a lot about heavy manufacturing and how can we do more of it here. My personal view is that it may be the UK's better off focusing in on some of the sort of smarter ends, AI, robotics, some of that sort of stuff, rather than necessarily big heavy manufacturing. I'll just put that there. On the gas crisis stuff, I think Scottish Power Iberdrola's position is, we've obviously, with Scottish Power, we've got that domestic and business supply business, so we are exposed to gas prices. I'm sure everyone on the panel is a Scottish Power customer, and you've been promised gas at a certain price for your fixed contract out to May 2022, and we've got to honour that. So we're exposed at that end, although being sort of big and fairly conservative, we're pretty well hedged in that bit. So that's not really impacting on our investment plans too much, and actually quite the reverse from Iberdrola. We've got a Capital Markets Day coming up in a few weeks, where there will be some quite, as there always are at these things, some pretty chunky numbers about what we're going to invest, where we're going to invest it. And the Scottish Power Iberdrola view is very much that the correct response to a gas price crisis is to reduce your exposure to gas prices, and the way of doing that is to build more renewable electricity.
With you, thanks. And Frank, what do you think?
So at first, I'm just going to disagree with Tom a bit. It's always fun when we have a panel discussion, we disagree with each other. Yeah. I think we need.
I can't storm out of my own bedroom, Frank. That's the problem. So.
Well, you could, but it's much less impressive.
Okay, it just looked petty, though. Yeah, go on, Frank. Sorry.
I think we need heavy manufacturing in this country. Like all the G7 countries have massive steel sectors. The UK is an anomaly in terms of how little steel it produces per GDP compared to any of the other major economies. I think the foundation industries are basically what they do on the tin. They are the foundation of more advanced digital smart technologies, and without them, you won't locate a turbine manufacturer here in this country if you don't have access to the steel that you produce and it goes into it. And it should be mentioned, for example, a steel turbine is 80+% steel. The turbines we put up here in this country, 0% UK steel. 0%. So I think it's just in terms of like, I would challenge that a bit, but going actually to answering your question. So I think in terms of there's two sides of this. One is the energy side. The high prices will push us to do all the things we need to do anyway. We need to get off gas. We need to have more renewables, more low carbon production, more nuclear. We need to switch over to heat pumps. We need to do more district heating. All the things that we need to do anyway is all incentivized by these higher prices. Whether you can then attract how the investment opportunity of that is changed, I can't really comment on that. So that's I think it really kind of just underlines and makes it even more clear why we need to do what we've already planned to do. We just need to do it faster now. The other aspect is looking at industrial decarbonisation specifically, and there it becomes perhaps slightly more tricky because having higher prices in general is, if everyone has the same high prices, sure, but the problem is that as prices get higher, the disparity widens between us and our competitors. So our electricity prices, because we're so much more dependent on gas in terms of production of electricity and it's marginal fuel here, we have higher electricity prices, much higher than we did a year ago compared to Germany. So the disparity between our prices have simply widened, and that becomes much more difficult then. So the issue we were facing a year ago becomes worse. A lot of the kind of options for decarbonising for our industry, apart from electrification, would be CCUS. You need more electricity for that. Again, that becomes a problem in itself. And then you're looking at hydrogen. And hydrogen, you need a lot of hydrogen. You need a ton of hydrogen to do hydrogen-based steel production. And again, I'm really interested in what the optimism in terms of bringing costs down, because we are concerned that it will be blue hydrogen, and that will be based on natural gas, and with very high natural gas prices, it will basically be very difficult to move over to that, even into the intermediate state where you do direct reduced iron, which is gas-based steel production, where the feedstock is natural gas, which is a stepping stone towards hydrogen. That will become incredibly difficult and uneconomic compared to it. So I think these higher prices could, particularly in the UK perspective, throw a spanner into the works unless government really kind of says this is what we're going to do, and we will do it regardless, and we'll provide the right incentive structures to it, because I don't necessarily think that the higher prices themselves will actually help when it comes to that. It probably will do the opposite.
Interesting. And Harley, what would be your thoughts?
So I think it's really interesting. Obviously, it's a very worrying time for businesses facing pressures due to higher costs. But I think it's a potentially kind of a sort of crossroads moment, or sort of certainly a test for our kind of political decision makers. I mean, it could really kind of go in two directions. You know, high gas prices could force politicians to it could scare the horses a little bit and sort of push us away from our commitment to net zero, or it could have the opposite effect. And I think, happily, speaking from a personal point of view, it seems to have had the latter effect, and the BEIS ministers and others have sort of rallied around and sort of emphasized how our dependence on gas and the expectation that there will kind of continue to be fluctuations and high costs sort of in the market in the future is more of an incentive for us to sort of accelerate and be a driver for sort of decarbonisation. So I'm hopeful that it will behave as a driver for the pace of decarbonisation. And as Frank sort of rightly pointed out, kind of a portion of why we have sort of high industrial electricity prices is to do with the fact that gas is, relatively a sort of a large part of our generation mix here. So, kind of being less dependent on gas will hopefully also bring down industrial electricity prices as well, sort of over the longer term. But I do recognise as well policy costs are sort of a third of those bills as well, and that's a political choice.
Yep. Oh, thank you so much. It's been a great panel. Thank you so much to all three of you.